Hello and welcome to my first attempt here to get a new channel started, the Biblionaut. Um, I have a friend who thought it would be a really good idea for me to riff on some books that I've been buying and reading, and he thought maybe it'd be a good idea to review a few. My cat also. Anyway, so um, I'd like to say first that I'm not doing this as any kind of an expert or other than just things that I've picked up over time. I'm a book enthusiast, and just as an enthusiast, there are certain things I like to look for. I've read a few books. You might see I've collected a few. This is behind me, a few shelves. Got quite a few more. Shelf space is as valuable to me as Manhattan real estate. So I have to be pretty choosy anymore what I buy, what I have to pass over. So, at any rate, fortunately, I travel a lot. Well, I don't know if that's fortunate or not, but for my job, I end up having to go to lots of different places, and sometimes I get an opportunity to stop at different places and look for books. Um, I'm kind of a book hound. Really, I don't like to pay a lot for books because I have plenty enough to read, as you can see, so I don't have to pay a premium. But when I find them at a price that I think is fair, I pick them up. And I end up going to a lot of library sales and thrift stores and picking things up for $1.50. And thus I kind of end up with a lot of what I call why not purchases. If it's only 50 cents, why not buy it? So I, I have a lot of why not stuff. But I was always interested. I thought there was something interesting in it when I picked it up for some reason. And so anyway, the main point of me doing this channel is to talk about just different book subjects and what I find interesting about them, what I find interesting about any particular book that I picked up, why I picked this one up, why I might have passed on a different kind of version of the same book. So, if you are a book enthusiast, then you may enjoy hearing some of these things that I'm talking about. Okay, well, the first thing that I found this trip, this time home, was a fantastic buy, I thought. Something I had not seen before, especially cheap. I'm not saying that it's not out there because I know what it is, but you would have to pay a premium for it. But this, it's a boxed set, actually, and it is Remembrance of Things Past by Marcel Proust. And, the thing of it is nice box set. It does have a little thing right there, but other than that, the box is in pretty good shape. Some tags from where I bought it, but those would come right off, some little stickers. And but the thing about Proust now, you know, I always used to call this guy Proust, because I didn't know. Because one of the things about having to pick this stuff up by reading rather than going to a class about it is you never heard anybody say. I never heard anybody say Proust or Proust. So for a long time I thought, Proust, Proust. How else would you say that? So I guess. Thanks to the internet, maybe, who knows? Maybe Monty Python did a sketch on Marcel Proust many years ago. It's pretty funny. Just Google Monty Python and Proust, and you'll get it. It's kind of funny. Any rate, so anyway, you can kind of see this is sort of an endeavor. There's quite a bit here. It's quite an undertaking to read this. And what was kind of ironic, or I guess it wasn't ironic, but it was one of those synchronicity things, is that I was actually reading the first book in this series. In English, it's called Swann's Way. And that's another thing. Okay, Marcel Proust, he was French, and so originally this was À la recherche du temps perdu, In Search of Times Past. English, they call it Remembrance of Times Past, or Remembrance of Things Past. I think at one time they used to call it In Search of Lost Time. But I was actually reading this The first episode, the first book in English is called Swan's Way. That's how it's generally translated. The original French, forgive my pronunciation, Du côté de chez Swan. That's basically, you think of by the side, see, Swan's Way, Swan's Pass, Swan's Road, this road that this narrator, who is never named, but we kind of think of it as Proust. As a child, he used to walk by this man's house, Swan, and Swan was a family friend, and Proust, the narrator, eventually falls in love with Swan's daughter. So that becomes important that he walks by this house, and thinking of Gilbert, the young girl that he falls in love with. Any rate, the book is essentially plotless, really. If you're looking for lots of high adventure, you're looking for a steamy love story, you're not going to find it here. This is more about, it's about how, we hold things in our mind that may not necessarily have a basis in reality. It's kind of like when you remember something that might have happened to you as a kid. You may have very intense memories of something, and you might speak to somebody else who was alive at that time, and they either have no memory of it or they remember it completely different. So it's like we hold a picture in our mind sometimes of things that there's a reality to us. It's how we perceive them, but may not really be objectively real. And that goes for perhaps like maybe you've read of a place or been told about a country that you've never visited, and so you have an imagination. You imagine what that might look like in your thoughts, and you might be extremely disappointed if you were to visit that place because it doesn't jive with what it is that you have been told or how you imagined it. So that's kind of, and then also too, like your personal relationships, in Swan, there's a long section in this first book of Swan where it talks about his first, a long, intense love affair that he had. And, this woman really wasn't that into him, and he was very, very much in love with her. And so, he would create these scenarios in his mind of how this relationship was progressing, or objectively it was not progressing, but he kept convincing himself it was. So in other words, we can impose a certain kind of framework over whatever's happening in our lives or in our memories, and that story exists in our mind, but it may be different than the reality. And that's kind of what Proust was examining here, and that's what I got out of a lot of the book. As I said, it's essentially plotless. It's a very minutely described story of what turn of the century France would have been like to live in this place. He came from an upper class family, and so as a child, he actually was. It seems to me like they had a decent life. They came from didn't seem like a fairly wealthy family, although the narrator is a very melancholy young fella, and he doesn't always appreciate maybe what he's got. But at any rate, I found it very worthwhile. You will find that this series is well regarded on many of those books you must read before you die lists. I don't necessarily agree with that, but it doesn't matter. You will find it on many lists of suggested books that you might find worthwhile. To me, the thing about Proust is, I think if you read the first 20 pages and you're like, wow, this is terrible, I can't stand this, then I would put it aside, because it's just not something that you're going to appreciate, because you're going to follow about another 500 pages of the same thing. So I know that for myself, it would not have been a book that I could have read 10, 20 years ago, perhaps. I just wouldn't have had the patience for it. Sometimes books strike us at a certain time. They come into our grasp at a time where, we're open to them, and we can enjoy them for what they are, and sometimes not. So I've found that to be true for many books recently that I've read that I just know that I wouldn't have had the time or the patience for. And not only wouldn't have had the patience, but I don't know that they would have been as affecting to me, because the older you get, the more you learn, and the more you learn, sometimes then you can see what people are talking about that you might not have been able to understand when you were 20 or 30 or even 40 maybe. So, at any rate, highly recommended if it's something that appeals to you, but if it's not, then it's not recommended at all. And let me set this aside. So, just as a side note, this was the version that I read. This is the Livre de Poche version. This was printed back in 1966 or 67, I can't remember. But at any rate, Livre de Poche books, I like these books. They're all in French. They're French paperbacks, and they were a very popular publisher back in all 50s, 60s, 70s. I think they're still in publish. They still publish. They had a very distinctive spine. If you're ever looking through books and you happen to be just glancing through a bookshelf like this, you can pick these out very easily, or at least I can. I'm used to them. And they published both French classics and also some more contemporary books. And actually, they actually have this entire series, just like what I had in that box set, published in a similar format of Livre de Poche. This just happens to be one I ran across just by luck. Probably spent 50 cents somewhere for it, and was glad to get it. That's me. That's kind of one man's treasure is another man's trash. But I was very happy to get it, and it helped me practice, because I'm not really fluent at all in French. I can read okay. Not very well. I read enough to be able to read through a book, and with the help of a dictionary. Couldn't speak it. If somebody was to speak it to me, I'd be lost. Speak too quickly. But at any rate, I do like these Livre de Poche books. It's kind of interesting in France. They never had a history of publishing a lot of books in hardback. Almost all of their books were softcover. It's just kind of strange. So if you were ever interested in finding maybe some old classic books, it's not that they didn't publish them. It's just that they were not, like in America, if a new book comes out, first it comes out in hardback, and then sometime later it's published in softcover. That was not really the tradition in France. They were more immediately published in a softcover. And let's see, I have one over here that's more indicative of the kind of books. Hold on, let me pause this just for a second. Okay, here I am. I'm back. I was talking about the books published in France, and how they didn't have the same kind of tradition of publishing in hardback. This is an example of this. This is how you will see a lot of books that are published in France. Not all. Again, it's changed. This is still a little bit older, but this Gallimard, again, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Gallimard, they are a very prominent publisher in France, and they published a lot of the books, and you will see, and they're very plain. It's kind of strange. They're very plain like this. They don't they didn't usually have the extreme covers. In America in the 40s, 50s, 60s, they would have very bright covers. Want to stand out on the shelves and capture your attention. But these are very plain. In fact, I think I have another one here too. This is another one you'll see a lot of in France, out of French books. Very plain. It's kind of strange. This is not Gallimard. This is a different publisher. I'm not sure. At any rate, Mercier de France. Anyway, so these kind, it's very strange, like I say, that, in America, you're gonna find something, bright and big and dynamic, and you just don't see that a lot of it. Now you see more of it now than you used to. You didn't used to have that many of those kind of these dynamic type books over there, but now they have quite a few more, or they trend in that direction a little bit more than they used to. Okay, again, no expert on French publishing. That's just some of the things that I picked up over time. that if you are interested or not, you may not be. Okay, and I don't know how much time I have, and I don't want to make this too long. Here's another book that I've picked up that I thought was a fantastic buy. And most of you have probably heard of Robert Heinlein. Okay, this is The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And the thing about science fiction books, especially your classics, you know, anything written by Heinlein, Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Sturgeon, Philip K. Dick, I don't know, those are, you know, say from maybe perhaps 1975 and earlier especially. The thing about science fiction books at that time was it's very hard to find any that were published and sold on your bookshelves. What you do find, and you find a lot of, are what you call the science fiction book club. And the science fiction book club published science fiction and fantasy titles, and through a like a subscription, kind of like if you remember the old record clubs, you know, if you're old enough to remember that, tapes and record clubs. If you're old enough to remember that, the science fiction book club worked basically on the same thing. They would have an offer, and you might send in $1, maybe 50 cents, who knows, and you would get 3 or 4 books for a special, and then you would have an option to choose their highlighted book, and you were under obligation perhaps maybe to buy 6 more throughout the year, whatever. I don't remember exactly the details, but there were a ton of science fiction book clubs written, published. And if you are a science fiction enthusiast, you've seen many, many, many of these. I don't know. I think I might have one. Okay, I used to have one right over here, and I have to. Well, here's one right here. Hold on. Okay, this is just at random. I just pulled this off the shelf. This is by a guy named L.P. Davies, The Artificial Man. And the thing about what makes these obvious, okay, if you deal with science fiction book clubs, you'll just get to know them once you see them. But what makes it very obvious is if you see down there in the very corner it says Book Club Edition, okay, and almost all of your science fiction book clubs had that little notation there, and that's very easy to find. So I like the science fiction book club. A lot of people turn their nose up at them, and so you can usually get them pretty cheap. But you know, it's a solid book. It's well constructed. It's not as well constructed as what they would call your trade edition. Your trade edition was what people sold on the stores. You go into Barnes and Noble or someplace like that. There's a hardcover edition like this, you know, and you know, you pick it up off the shelf, you buy it, whatever your bookseller was at that time. Barnes and Noble was just a little bitty place, but way back when. But say in the 60s, maybe you went to, I think Dalton's used to be a big place, B. Dalton's, and there's other places. At any rate, these you got through the mail, and these you bought online, at the store. And the reason why, and how you can usually tell, it's not hard and fast, but usually you can tell because you can see a little price up there in the corner. All right, this was originally sold for $9.95, and you see there's no book club edition at the bottom of this page. Okay, so that's how you can, most of the time, probably 99% of the time, you can tell the difference between the two: a book club edition and a regular trade edition. Okay, so to find a trade edition of any of the, especially the old masters or the old classics, Heinlein, Ray Bradbury, there's just tons of them. Guys, you know, like Robert Silverberg, even earlier than that. If you find any of these, or if you have them, then hold on to them, because you've got something that collectors are very interested. Don't sell them at a garage sale for 25 cents. I guess is what I would say. Hold on to them, because they're not very rare. You might find a few of these, but you might find you know, hundreds of this in this kind of format. And again, you know, just because somebody places a value on it doesn't mean that one's more valuable than the other. I like these. You know, I think these are really neat. If I have a particular author that I enjoy reading, I like having it in hardback. It's a little sturdier. It holds up a little better, and so I would much rather have it in the science fiction book club than a paperback. Although I do like paperbacks as well. I'm sure I'll get to that someday too. So I don't know. For one day, I don't know. Maybe that's a good start. I didn't even get to review anything, but I don't. I'd like to keep this under about 20 minutes at a shot. So we'll try one. And I like talking about books. So if this works, then and if anybody's interested in it, who knows? Maybe even if you're not interested, I may do it anyway, just because I like hearing myself talk about books. Anyway. I hope you found something out that you didn't know before. And if there is something that you got a question about, I would certainly, about the books that I talked about today, I would certainly go over. Doesn't bother me to keep talking. Okay, well, thanks for tuning in. And if you like it, subscribe. All right.